I'm Ed Gallardi. We're continuing our video series where we examine New Testament doctrines using only types and shadows from the Old Testament. The particular doctrine we'll be looking at here is total depravity. And for the sake of this video, the definition I'll use is that due to the devastating effect of Adam's sin on all humanity, our minds, hearts, and wills are so corrupted that we are completely unable to desire God, to seek after Him, or to come to know Him on our own. Our only hope of ever being saved is for God to reach down and save us completely on His own, without any indication from us that we want to be saved. Again, if you're wondering about types and shadows and how it is that they can point directly to New Testament doctrines, I encourage you to look at the introductory video I did on types and shadows. Briefly here, the definition of a shadow that I use is that a biblical shadow is a God-directed event, command, law, person, structure, etc., that occurred in the physical realm prior to the New Testament, and that points directly to and informs us about a corresponding truth in the spiritual realm in the New Testament. Now, according to these scriptures that you see and many more, the Old Testament, or the law, was a copy and shadow of the church. God made these shadows, and so you can be certain that they point directly and unerringly to New Testament doctrines. Now, just before we get into total depravity, I always like to increase your knowledge of types and shadows. So let's real briefly look at the tabernacle under the law. The tabernacle was that dwelling place of God. God was to dwell in the tabernacle in the midst of the kingdom of Israel. In the New Testament, God dwells in our hearts. So the tabernacle was a shadow of each Christian. To confirm that, we look at 1 Corinthians 3:16, and it says, "Do you not know that you are a temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you?" So for brevity's sake, let's just consider one aspect of the tabernacle, and that is that it faced east. The tribe of Judah and two other tribes camped on the east, and whenever the tabernacle was to be moved, it headed out eastward. And when it settled again, it again faced east. Ezekiel talks about the presence of God leaving the tabernacle or temple when Israel was unfaithful, and the presence of God leaves out through the east gate. And again in the new enlarged prophetic temple, as the presence of God returns, it returns from the east and enters. In the New Testament, we're told that Jesus, when He comes, He will come from the east. Matthew 24:27 says, "For just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be." So when Jesus returns, He returns from the east. So what is that telling us? That all Christians need to face east? No. Remember, we go from the physical to the spiritual. So in the spiritual, our hearts need to be oriented towards God. So if our hearts are oriented towards God, when Jesus returns, He will be able to enter us. So the lesson is, keep your hearts oriented towards God. Now let's look at total depravity. So according to total depravity, we're completely unable to desire God or come to know Him on our own. It requires God first to select us and then to make us one of His own, even though we have not given Him any indication we want that. One of the great shadows of becoming a Christian is the process of marriage. Paul confirms that for us in the New Testament, when after a dialogue about the husband-wife relationship, he adds, "For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church." The process of marriage requires that a man and woman first meet each other, and then get to know each other, and finally to desire each other enough that they'd be willing to commit to spending the rest of their lives together. The lifelong commitment we make in marriage is a shadow of the lifelong commitment we make to Christ when we become Christians. So with the shadow, that humans are the female or the wife, and Jesus is the male or the groom. Imagine what it would be like if a man could arbitrarily select a woman that didn't desire him or even know him, and make her his lifelong companion. That wouldn't be a very good situation, for sure. So for the marriage shadow to be accurate, it must be the case that we can come to know God and desire him, and then and only then be willing to make a lifelong commitment to him. So let's see if we can find that in the Old Testament. So what we want to determine is how people in the Old Testament could come to know God, and then to love him, and then to choose to follow him for the rest of their lives. Well, it turns out that people could see God by observing the nation of Israel when they're obedient to God. Here's what Moses said just before the Israelites entered the Promised Land. If you obey the commands of the Lord your God and walk in his ways, the Lord will establish you as his holy people, as he swore he would do. And all the nations of the world will see that you are a people claimed by the Lord, and they will stand in awe of you. Moses said that everyone in the world would be able to see the power of God just by observing God's leading of Israel and the great blessing he promised them. Solomon, in his dedication prayer of the temple, said this: also concerning the foreigner who is not of your people Israel, when he comes from a far country for your name's sake, for they will hear of your great name, and of your mighty hand, and of your outstretched arm. When he comes and prays towards this house, here in heaven, your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name, to fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have built is called by your name. Again, Solomon says that everyone in the world will see God's great power and his mighty outstretched arm, and many would come to follow him. And of course we know many did come and join themselves to Israel. Rahab the harlot, we are even treated to her thought process as she comes to know God. Here's what she said: I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any of us any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Rahab came to know God by observing the power of God through the nation of Israel. She did follow God. She joined Israel, and she had the high honor of being one of the ancestors of Jesus Christ. King David said that people could see God just by observing nature, God's great creation. Here's what he said in Psalms 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. David is saying that very creation speaks of God continually, so that no one has an excuse not to know him. They could come to know God through the preaching of the word. Jonah preached to Nineveh, and they all repented. Another way people could see God was through the life of a single righteous person. Consider Ruth, the Moabitess. Naomi, along with her husband and 2 sons, traveled to the land of Moab because of a famine in Israel. While there, her 2 sons married Moabite women. But then her husband and the 2 sons died. When Naomi was planning to return to Israel, she told her 2 daughters-in-law, "Stay here in your land and marry amongst your people." One of them did, but Ruth refused, and here's what she said. "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Ruth made a conscious decision to follow the God of righteous Naomi. She did return to Israel with her, and she as well had the very high honor of being an ancestor of Jesus. The Queen of Sheba heard of the works and great wisdom of Solomon from a far country, and she traveled to Jerusalem to see for herself. After spending some time with Solomon, here's what she said. "Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness." She saw the justice and righteousness of God through the life of Solomon. We don't know whether she ever chose to follow God or not, but we do know that she saw the hand of God. Another way people could see God was through his miracles. Naaman was the captain of the Syrian army, a powerful man and highly respected, but he was a leper. He had a little Israelite slave girl with him in his home, and one day the little girl said, "I wish my master could visit the prophet in Israel, for then he could be healed." Naaman gathered an entourage and quite a bit of wealth and traveled into Israel and came to where Elisha the prophet was. Elisha didn't even come out to talk to him. He sent his servant out and said, "Go dip in the Jordan 7 times and you'll be healed." Naaman was enraged. I think he expected a lot of pomp and ceremony. He was going to return to Syria, but his servants talked him into going and doing as the prophet had said. So he did, and after he came out of the Jordan for the 7th time, he was completely healed. Now he returned to Elisha the prophet, and now face to face, here's what Naaman said. "Behold now, I know that there is no God in all the earth, but in Israel." Naaman did become a follower of God that day, and he made arrangements so that when he returned to Syria, he could continue to worship God. Another way people could see God was through his signs. The Magi saw the star in the east. They recognized that this was a sign that a king had been born in Israel. They followed the star, and it led them to Bethlehem, where Mary and baby Jesus were. Here's what the scriptures record of that incident. "After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh." Gifts that would be prophetic of the ministry that lay ahead of Jesus. The shadows tell a very clear picture. Everyone in the Old Testament had the opportunity to see God, to come to know him, and to worship him. Through one means or another, they could all see the hand of God, and many came to chose to follow him. They could all see God's great power, his majesty, his sovereignty, and his righteousness. The shadows speak loud and clear, and they declare that the teaching of total depravity is not a church doctrine. So stay tuned until next time when we examine another church doctrine, and once again, we let the shadows speak.